Let's jump to rapamycin since you mentioned it, and we can give a very quick idea on what rapamycin is. But since we last spoke, more bearish, more bullish, and why?
I'm a bull. Yeah.
Dogecoin and Rappa, diamond hands. All right. So what is Rappa?
By the way, I know what the diamond hands thing is, but what is it? Where did it come from? Like,
I have no idea.
Yeah,
I have no idea where diamond hands comes from.
Okay, I was like, did I miss that somewhere in my reading?
In your econ classes?
Yeah. So,
no, I don't think so.
Okay.
So what is rapamycin?
So rapamycin is a drug that is a naturally occurring antifungal agent made by a bacteria that was discovered on Easter Island back in the 1960s.
Otherwise known as Rapa Nui.
Right. Rapa Nui is the correct name for Easter Island, and the bacteria Streptomyces hygroscopicus, which was discovered there by a group of explorers. Explorers is maybe the wrong word, but people doing sort of medical prospecting. A group from Montreal, I believe, in 1966. They took a bunch of soil and dirt back from Rapa Nui to the lab in Montreal, where it sort of sat there unattended to for about 5 years. A chemist, a very astute chemist by the name of Suren Segal.
Great name.
Yeah, he started
related
mucking
to Steven
around.
Seagal? No, different.
And no ponytail, fortunately. So Suren did some really interesting chemistry, isolated the compound, and noticed it had these really remarkable properties, which was it was the most potent antifungal agent he had ever seen, or the world had ever seen, frankly. At the time, as his son Ajit tells the story, who I've gotten to know a little bit, he felt he had basically come onto the biggest blockbuster cure for athlete's foot the world was ever going to know. And right about that time, the company he worked for closed its Montreal headquarters, actually laid many people off, ordered the destruction of all non-viable compounds, and shipped him off to New Jersey. In one of the greatest acts of scientific fortuity, he did not follow orders, and he instead stuck said rapamycin into a little mini freezer that he and his family transported to their new home in New Jersey. They kept it in the freezer for many years until ultimately another drug company purchased the company he worked for. And the new management said, hey, anybody working on anything interesting? He said, I'm working on this thing interesting that I haven't looked at in a few years. And they said, bring it out.
Must have been an interesting lawyer conversation based on the not following orders.
Yeah.
Continue, yeah.
So out came rapamycin, which he named. Mycin,
Cool.
and mycin is typically the prefix, the suffix, I guess, that we use, or what's the second part of a word called? Suffix, yeah, for antimicrobial agents, and of course, Rapa is a tribute to the Rapa Nui.
Like azithromycin.
Correct.
Yeah.
So it quickly became clear that this had remarkable anti-proliferative properties. So it could stop things from proliferating. So that was obviously a big part of,
Not just fungi.
right, exactly. And in particular, it was very effective at making a certain type of lymphocyte, which is a type of white blood cell, not proliferate. And it then basically went down the path. Eventually, Pfizer then bought Amyris, which was the company that bought his previous company, whose name I don't even remember at this point. Pfizer ended up pursuing this, and it was FDA approved in 1999 for treatment of organ transplantation. So patients that have an organ transplanted have to be put on a really heavy regimen of drugs to suppress a part of their immune system called the cellular immune system that will attack a foreign organ.
What is that called? Host graft?
No, graft versus host
Graft versus
is
host.
actually when the organ, usually it's in the case of lymphoma or leukemia, when someone has a bone marrow transplant, and the graft, what they've been transplanted, attacks the host.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
This is really host versus graft, but
Yeah,
we don't
host
usually
versus
call
graft.
it that. Yeah, but traditional sort of, rejection. And actually, I did a really cool podcast on the topic of organ transplantation history with a guy named Chris Sonnenday. And I know this subject well, but having the discussion with Chris really opened my eyes to just what a beautiful story it is, and what the big breakthroughs were with drug development, and how, at one point it was like all you could give people was prednisone, and you couldn't save anybody. And then, you had other drugs like cyclosporin that were introduced. But then you get into this third generation of amazing drugs like rapamycin that took organ, preservation to a higher level.
Now, you're not swapping kidneys.
How do you know?
Well, at least not since the last time you sold one in Tijuana. Settled a bet. But why would you take rapamycin? I know I'm skipping ahead a little bit.
Well, let's skip ahead. So 99, this drug comes on the market for organ rejection, and about 12 years later, a study gets published by Rich Miller, Randy Strong, and colleagues as part of what's called the Interventions Testing Program, or the ITP, which is an amazing NIH-funded program that tests molecules that are believed to have a shot at enhancing longevity. And it does so in a really, really rigorous way, probably the most rigorous way we can test small animals. I've interviewed Rich Miller as well. Probably one of my 5 favorite podcasts in terms of like nerding out on all of the molecules that can potentially impact longevity. And rapamycin was in many ways the poster child for the ITP program because, first of all, it's hard to get anything to live longer. Second of all, when they were making the formulation for the rapamycin to feed the mice, and these were very special mice. These were not your typical crappy lab mice that have no bearing whatsoever to real animals. These are a very special type of mice that are much more akin to real animals. And that's a very important distinction between what happens in 99% of mouse research, which is almost inapplicable to humans. And it's why so many drugs that get tested in these, B6 mice and things like that, show some marker of success and they become wild failures beyond the mice. But this was different. They had trouble getting the formulation to work. And by the time they finally did, the mice were like 20 months old, which means they're almost at the end of their life. They're like 70-year-old, 65-year-old mice. And they contemplated just scrapping the experiment, but they were like, screw it, let's just run it late. So they started feeding the treatment group with rapamycin, and the placebo group get to continue eating their regular chow.
Okay, so it was oral administration.
Yes, the rapamycin was mixed into their chow. And lo and behold, the rapamycin group, despite initiating treatment so late in life, had a staggering improvement in lifespan. There's been so many ITPs that have replicated this. I don't want to misquote it, but it's something to the effect of like a 17 or 19% improvement in the males, or in the females, and 11 to 12% in the males. And remember, the ITP uses a very rigorous way of assessing this, which is they're taking a look at the remaining life. They're taking a look at total life, not just remaining life. So it's an even higher bar to clear how much lifespan elongation happens. They, of course, immediately went and repeated the study, administering the dose when they were younger, and saw an even greater response. This has been repeated over and over and over again. And to my knowledge, there is not a single animal study that has tested this hypothesis that has not found this result.
Oh, that's wild.
Which again is very unusual.
Yeah. So it's just replicated over and over and over.
It's replicated nonstop. What is also interesting is when looking at other markers, other interesting things such as vision and hearing and other markers of health span, we continue to see improvements in these things for animals as well. And as I think we even spoke about before, a guy named Matt Kaberlein, who I'm just interviewed for a second time for the podcast, has been studying this in companion dogs and looking at heart function, because as you know, basically 2 things kill companion dogs, primarily heart failure and cancer. And so the question is, what would you be able to do to mitigate especially heart failure, congestive heart failure in dogs, especially large dogs, which are more susceptible to this. And again, the results, though the research is limited because there's not an enormous interest in funding this research, and it's expensive to fund research in dogs that live so long, it's all pointing in the same direction. So when you contrast metformin and rapamycin, you have the opposite thing, right? In metformin, we have tons of human data that are not randomized, but are suggesting in cohorts that metformin is also protective but in a subset of people that have diabetes. So it's not as clear how protective metformin will be in people that do not. In the ITP, metformin did not succeed. In other words, metformin did not extend life in the mice when given alone. When it was given with rapamycin, it did, but you could argue that was all the rapamycin. I'm more bullish on Rapa simply because I've been taking it now for 3 years. Outside of,
and you can hear dog whistles.
Outside of the aphthous ulcers, which are the most annoying side effect of them. Those are those little
mouth ulcer.
Yeah, the little mouth sores you get.
Like a canker sore.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which you don't get. I don't get them de novo, but if one of my kids headbutts me, which they do at an alarming frequency, if I break a piece of my gum, like it's going to be an aphthous ulcer.
Although, what is it called again?
Aphthous ulcer.
Aphthous.
Yeah. APHTHOS.
Whew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nasty.
It doesn't sound fun. So is that the only documented in healthy normals? I don't know who would fund this research if anyone would, or I don't know I guess I don't even know what the metrics would be, but.
Well, that gets to the problem. We don't have a meaningful biomarker of aging.
Yeah.
I mean, that's full stop the biggest problem in aging research today, hands down. Nothing else matters.
Yeah.
When you don't have a really good biomarker for aging, we're sort of sitting around twiddling our thumbs, pontificating, doing studies that look at things that aren't that interesting, or things that are interesting but are like, first order, second order, but we can't see the whole polynomial, right? Like if you think back to what a Taylor series is in calculus, if you're trying to use a polynomial to estimate sine x, the first order term is x equals y. That's interesting for about that much. But, when you really want to know x minus x cubed over 3 factorial plus x to the 5 over 5 factorial, like when you want to really start figuring out the shape of this thing, you're just going to need better tools.
So as we're talking about rapamycin, I think naturally a lot of people listening will think of lifespan. It's a term they're more familiar with, right?
Yep.
Start to finish. What are you clocking in terms of years? And then there's health span. And, I took a note, as I always take notes during these conversations, about the vision and the hearing. So I'm 43 and recently had a, not quite an audiology test. I mean, it was quite basic hearing test done.
Mm-hmm.
And seemed to have some minor hearing loss in the higher ranges on one side. Could have been some of the ambient noise in the room. I don't know. I'd like to try to replicate it. But could one make a compelling argument that rapamycin could improve restoring that type of hearing? Or is that too much of a stretch?
No, it's just too soon to say. I think it's certainly plausible, but I think it's too early to say. I mean, we've seen that in animals now. We've seen that in animals, but I don't know if that's going to translate to humans.
Has that been seen in multiple species?
I've only seen it in mice.
In mice,
yeah.
But these are kind of the feral mice versus the Holstein cows of mice.
To be honest with you, I don't remember what mice were used in that study, but it's quite possible they were your garden variety, genetically not so interesting mice. Yeah.
Got it.
You've hinted at or outright identified a big challenge, which is how do you study a drug in healthy people? And by the way, a drug that has a little bit of a bad rap, right? Immune suppressing drugs don't have people very excited.
Yep.
And until 2014, until Christmas Day 2014 or Christmas Eve Day, I didn't think of this as very interesting. So in 2011, you have the first ITP published. And it's like, wow, that's cool, but I used to give this to kidney transplant patients. I'm not taking that. And then you had Joan Manick was the lead author on a study that came out at the end of 2014 that looked at a rapamycin derivative called everolimus. And it was given to 65-year-olds in the following fashion. There were 4 groups, a group that was given a placebo, a group that was given 1 milligram every day, a group that was given 5 milligrams once a week, and a group that was given 20 milligrams once a week. And they were given this for a period of 8 weeks, I believe. And then they were taken off everything for another period of, I believe, 6 weeks. And then they were challenged with a flu vaccine and then looked to see who mounted the best immune response. And, counter to what you would expect, the people on rapamycin developed a better immune response. which flew entirely in the face of what one would have expected. The group getting 5 milligrams once a week was in the best. They had the best response and the fewest side effects. So the 20, we probably don't want to go down this path because it's just more complicated. There are two complexes of mTOR. There's this, we got to talk about mTOR. How does rapamycin work, right? It works by inhibiting something called mTOR, the mechanistic target of rapamycin.
We could also refer people to our conversation with David Sabatini.
Absolutely. Back on Easter Island.
Back on Easter Island. So long story short, there was a trip. It may or may not have involved some wine to Rapa Nui, to Easter Island. And one of our trip mates was David Sabatini, who, cue Peter,
was the first person to identify how rapamycin worked in mammals.
Yeah. So we talk about that quite a bit in that episode. So I think if you just search Tim Ferriss Show Easter Island, I can't imagine there are many results. And you will see an amazing crow arm displayed by another one of our trip mates, which happens to just be an artifact from a weird panoramic shot. But we did use that photo just to chafe his nuts a bit. So let's see.
Yeah, so let's just wrap that up by saying that the 5 milligram dose seemed to be the sweet spot once a week. It produced all the benefit without the side effects. 20 produced a similar benefit, but had too many side effects.
Do you no longer take metformin?
I do not.
Interesting.